Hey Michelle, good to see you. We'll get started in a few moments. Just wait for more people to jump on. Hey Ashley, good to see you too. Hey Thiago, hope you're all doing okay. Yeah, so we'll just wait a moment or two and see if more people join, and then we'll get started. Hi Jane, it's good to see you. Yeah. So there may not be as many people today, which is fine. I know some people struggle to make the 8 p.m. showing. Uh, hey Dan Marshall, good to see you too. Hope you're doing well, Jane. So today's webinar is about flexibility strength, and I'm going to just be talking about the motor abilities that we call uh, flexibility and strength and how they all interact with each other. We'll wait another 30 seconds and then we'll officially start. So I've set up uh, my workspace a bit better than yesterday. Obviously, yesterday I was looking up to the corner. Now I have Facebook here and I have my screen up here. So hopefully it'll all go smoothly, and hopefully you'll enjoy it. So give another 20 seconds and we'll get cracking. But I appreciate everybody's feedback and engagement with yesterday's video. Hopefully you found it informative. Um, Christina, yeah, no, that's no problem, Christina. You're more than welcome. Yeah, that's what I like to do. I like to give people information so that you can figure some of the stuff out for yourself and you can see what's true and what isn't true. All right, so we'll make a start, and people can join in as they want to. I'll probably leave questions till the end, just because it'll make things run a bit smoother because we ran over a bit yesterday. So, hello everybody. I guess I should look at this camera because Facebook's over here. I'll check if you have any questions as we go along, leave them in the comments and I'll answer them towards the end. Okay. So hello, and a very warm welcome to this. It's the second day of our free 3-day of flexibility event. And again, thank you to everyone who came to yesterday's live stream. I hope you found it all informative and enlightening. And if you're watching this or yesterday's video on, you're watching it back on replay, or you're watching it again, and you have any thoughts, comments, or questions, just leave them in the comments section, and I will answer them if I don't answer them in the actual webinar. I love interacting with you guys. I love reading the comments. So, please let me know what your thoughts are, or if there's anything that came to your mind after the session that you would like clarity or help with. So, obviously, yesterday's event, day one, covered some of the myths that get spread around the health and fitness industry about flexibility and stretching. And I hope that at least one thing that you took away from yesterday's session was that there is a lot of nuance and subtle differences as far as flexibility and stretching are concerned. It's not just this one thing. And you'll see as we go into the motor abilities that all of our physical capacities as a human being break down into smaller parts or different components. And, just like anything else we do as human beings, flexibility and flexibility training are not a one size fits all thing. There's not just one type of flexibility, there's not just one type of stretching. The flexibility demands are different for each person and for each sport or activity, and even for a particular position in a sport or activity. Footballers at different parts of the playing field have different functional demands. And so in today's seminar, we're going to look at the relationship between flexibility and strength and how they come together to form what we call a binary motor ability. And if you don't know what that phrase means, please don't worry, I'm going to explain what everything here means. But flexibility and strength come together to form a binary motor ability called flexibility strength, as it's shown on screen. I'll also explain why we call it that. Now, I've been asked a question in the past, and no doubt some of you might even be thinking this yourself, but whenever I talk about flexibility, strength, people usually ask me, isn't that just mobility? And the answer from the perspective of the scientific and academic literature is no. If you remember from yesterday's session, mobility is primarily used in the scientific literature to describe a mobile base of support, i.e., it's the ability to walk from point A to point B safely and efficiently. So that means that you can move without assistance, without increased risk of injury, and without expending unnecessary amounts of energy to complete the movement task. On the flip side of that is stability, which is used to describe a stable base of support. Okay, and it's the ability to stay standing and balanced despite external forces acting on your body that would otherwise tip you over if you didn't possess sufficient stability. And as you can see on screen, mobility and stability come together to form something called your functional capability. And this is a phrase that's used throughout the motor learning and motor control literature. And it's basically your ability to do anything with your body, whether that is sitting down or standing up out of a chair, walking up and down stairs, running, playing a round of golf, picking a child or pet up off the floor, carrying groceries from the car to your house, washing the dishes, dressing yourself, etc. And all the things you can do with your body are determined by your functional capability. Your functional capability emerges from the interaction of your mobility and stability. Likewise, your mobility and stability emerge from the interaction of your motor abilities, which we'll look at in more detail momentarily. But your motor abilities are the various individual physical capacities of your body that contribute to your overall ability to move. And they are the base level of our motor fitness that we can influence with physical training inputs. So the most baseline thing we can influence are our motor abilities. And mobility and stability emerge from the interaction of these motor abilities, and functional capability emerges from the interaction of mobility and stability. So we train the motor abilities, that influences our mobility and stability, and they influence our functional capability. Hopefully you're following so far. Now, this word emergence, okay, it refers to an emergent property or something which emerges, right? So an emergent property is something that doesn't exist on its own, but rather it arises as a result of other things at smaller scales interacting. And because mobility and stability are classified as emergent properties in the motor control literature, you can't actually train them directly. Okay, you can only train the motor abilities because motor abilities are the only thing you can directly influence. And because mobility and stability can't be trained directly, there's actually no such thing as mobility or stability training. So that's just something to bear in mind. Hang on, my screen's just going funny. Can you guys still see me okay? Just leave me a comment, tell me you can see me okay. No, it seems to be fine again. I'm still recording. Hopefully you guys can still see me. My screen was just going funny then. Hopefully it hasn't interrupted the recording for you guys. So that statement I've just said, there's no such thing as mobility and stability training because you can't influence them directly. It's probably going to confuse, and it might even annoy some people watching this. But remember what I said yesterday. I'm just telling you what these terms mean from a scientific perspective. If you want to use these words to mean something else, then you can do that. That's your right according to the principle of free speech, and I support free speech. But just be mindful that your definition might not align with what the scientific literature says. And so you're probably undermining your claims at being science-based. So to give you an example, if you want to improve your mobility, which is your ability to maintain a mobile base of support, and you want to improve it by, say, increasing your stride length or how big of a step you can take with your legs, you'll want to increase the range of motion at your hips and probably at the knees and ankles too. And so the motor ability you will work on is flexibility, which is the ability for joints to change position. The improvement in flexibility will flow into the kind of metaphorical space where all of the motor abilities interact, and an improved level of mobility will emerge. But mobility is not measured by range of motion. We measure mobility by asking, can you complete this particular task? Yes or no. The same goes for stability. If you want to train your stability or your ability to maintain a stable base of support, say, for example, you take the train on your commute to work, and the rocking of the carriage on the railway track keeps making you stumble and fall over, then the primary motor ability you're going to work on is strength, because strength is your ability to produce force, and thus you can exert sufficient forces against the external forces created by the rocking motion of the train carriage on the tracks in a way that you can stop yourself from falling over. The increase in strength has flowed into the mix of all these other motor abilities, and an improved level of stability emerges from that mix. In both of these cases, you were not training mobility or stability directly. You trained flexibility and strength directly, and consequently, mobility and stability improved as an indirect result of that. So that's just to give you an overview of motor abilities and how they contribute to functional capability. Before we move on, I just want to check that there's still a good connection and you guys can see and hear me okay. If someone can just drop a message saying okay, I'll move on. Okay, well, nobody's commenting. I don't know if anybody's watching, but I'm going to carry on anyway for the sake of the recording. Yeah, so hopefully you guys will enjoy this on playback. So we're going to talk now about motor abilities, and a general trend of exercise science is that we name something based on the thing which is being trained or developed, or the thing which we're measuring. A strength exercise develops strength, so it's called a strength exercise. A flexibility exercise develops flexibility, so it's called a flexibility exercise. But what if you're doing an exercise that develops both of these things simultaneously? Well, again, we call something by the thing that's being developed or the things that we're measuring. So we just call it a flexibility strength exercise. But why flexibility strength and not strength flexibility? Well, because flexibility is fundamental to all of the motor abilities, it takes primacy. But ultimately, whether you call it flexibility strength or strength flexibility is entirely up to you. For the sake of this workshop, I'm just going to call it flexibility strength. A good example of a flexibility strength exercise is the straight leg deadlift, and it has other names like Romanian deadlift, stiff leg deadlift, and so on. But choose whatever name you prefer to call it. Now, typically, this exercise is used to develop both strength and range of motion through the posterior chain, or the muscles on the back of the body, especially in the hamstrings group. There's three muscles: semitendinosus, semimembranosus and the biceps femoris. We measure strength by monitoring the amount of load or the amount of weight on the barbell. And we measure flexibility by monitoring how far the barbell can be lowered to the floor. Naming it based upon the motor abilities depends upon the intention of the exercise and what's being measured. So if the intention of the exercise is to increase flexibility and strength, and we're measuring flexibility and strength, it's therefore a flexibility strength exercise. And because it develops two motor abilities, we call it a binary motor ability, binary for two. Most exercises that you will do in the gym will be a combination of two or maybe three motor abilities at most, because the body has limited resources that it can dedicate to developing motor abilities to any reasonable standard in either a single exercise or a whole workout. All right, so I'll give it a minute, and then I'll try and pick up where I left off. If not, I'll just continue, and you'll have to watch them back to back. I do apologize. Yeah, so I'm not the greatest fan of Facebook for this reason. They just, hey Ashley, good to see you. Yeah, so Facebook has this thing where they just censor anything and everything. I created this Facebook group to make this information easier to access for you. And you know, I go and do original content, and they go and throw a copyright claim in there. It's absolutely bonkers. Unless it was somebody being angry because I told them what mobility actually means. That's just a joke. But give it 10 more seconds, and I'll try and pick up where I left off. Okay, so I'm just going to try and pick this up where I left off. So I talked about how when we develop two motor abilities with one exercise, it's called a binary motor ability. And like I said, most exercises that you will do, either alone or in an entire workout, will be a combination of two or three motor abilities at most. And that's because the body has very limited resources available to it. It has a finite amount of energy, and it can only tolerate a limited amount of fatigue before you start to interfere with development of the motor abilities. So before we continue, I'll just quickly explain what the other motor abilities are. Endurance is your ability to continue doing a particular task or activity for a given length of time, okay? Or being able to do it for a determined length of time without diminishing the quality of your physical efforts. In simpler terms, endurance is your ability to resist fatigue. When we get tired, our ability to coordinate our muscles and limbs decreases, and the greater the fatigue, the greater the reduction in coordination, work rate, etc. There are usually, there are four types of fatigue described in the scientific literature. They are mental fatigue, sensory fatigue, emotional fatigue, and physical fatigue. And most discussions around how fatigue affects performance will understandably be based upon physical fatigue. So speed is pretty straightforward. It's how much of something you can do in a given time frame, i.e., how much distance you can move, how far you can move a limb, how much you can react to a particular stimulus, etc. Agility is the ability to. Everybody says hi again. Let's hope everyone notices that they need to refresh the page to see it's live again. Yeah, I mean, I'm recording it anyway, so there'll be two parts to it, I guess. But man, it's Facebook. It's an absolute mess. So agility is the ability to quickly and fluidly change the movement of your whole body. And when we think about it, it's a motor ability that actually emerges from the interaction of three other motor abilities: coordination, strength, and speed. But its training is so specific, and it's described so often in the scientific literature as its own motor ability that for all intents and purposes, we describe it as a motor ability in its own right, even though it is and emergent property. And finally, coordination is your ability to localize processes of excitation to the proper motor units and prevent an overflow of excitation to other motor units, or in simpler terms, it's the ability to control your body. Okay, and coordination is a fascinating subject in its own right, and it ties in closely to motor neuroscience and motor control, which is one of my favorite subjects. And each of the motor abilities has several subtypes. Flexibility has 4, as you know: dynamic active, dynamic passive, static active, and static passive. But coordination is actually made up of 8 subcomponents, so it pretty much has the most unique subcomponents. Strength has more or less the same number, but they are just variations of the ability to exert force. The components of coordination, if you're interested, are, let me see if I can get this right, balance, kinesthetic differentiation of strength, kinesthetic differentiation of joint position, spatial awareness, sense of rhythm, synchronization of movements in time, and movement adequacy. And I'm going to be bringing out material in the future which is going to explain what all those things are. A lot of times when people use the word mobility, they say it's either a combination of flexibility and strength, or a combination of flexibility, strength, and control. And by control, they mean coordination. But again, that, you know, those definitions are pretty unstable and quite sloppy, because number one, well, what type of flexibility, strength, and control are they referring to? Most people don't know, and so they can't expand upon their definition, and so using mobility in that way is pretty limited. And number two, what about the other motor abilities, right? If mobility is your ability to move, do we just leave speed, endurance, and agility out of it, right? All that says is that people who use mobility or mobility training are just really slow, and they have no endurance or agility, right? So it doesn't make sense to use that word. Again, mobility is all of these motor abilities coming together to determine your ability to maintain a mobile base of support. And they all interact at some level, but out of all of them, it's the relationship between flexibility and strength that is most useful to us when we're trying to develop range of motion. Keep looking over here because I think you guys are watching, because Facebook's over here, but I realize you're on this screen. And the relationship between flexibility and speed is also incredibly important when we're trying to develop dynamic flexibility, because flexibility is speed specific. But when it comes to developing static passive and static active flexibility, building strength through the full range of motion, not just in the middle like most people do, and also not just at the end range of motion, which seems to be a lot of people's focus, but also at short ranges of motion and short muscle lengths. It can supercharge your flexibility training, and you can make progress much faster, in addition to getting other benefits that are not conferred by doing just passive stretching, such as increased tissue tolerance, which is important for minimizing risk of injury, and volitional strength, which is important for sports performance as well as everyday life. And nobody else is commenting, so I'm assuming that I've lost the live stream again. I'm just going to drive through. If you can see me or hear me, leave a comment. If Facebook has blocked the live stream again, I'll just push through and I'll upload the recording, and I'll answer questions in the comments. So we come to oh, that's cool, Lam. Thank you. So it's still working well at your end. It may just be us two, I don't know, but you know, hopefully other people can see too. So I mentioned that each motor ability has its own subtypes. Yeah, I don't know what's going on with Facebook. It's being really pedantic at the minute. So I mentioned that each motor ability has its own subtypes, and strength is no different. And the types of strength I'm primarily referring to here when discussing flexibility strength are the different categories of volitional strength, okay? And that's the amount of force we can produce voluntarily with our muscles. But there is another type of strength, which I've not listed here, and it's important, but it's not directly related to the amount of force you can produce with your muscles, and that's called structural strength. And the phrase structural strength refers to how strong the tissues are, or how strong the structure of the muscle tendon unit is, and it's how much stress those tissues can take, or how much they can tolerate before they break. And so it's also called tissue tolerance. Both voluntary strength and structural strength are very important, although voluntary strength is more useful for producing movement and therefore athletic performance, whereas structural strength is more useful for offsetting the chance of injury. And while regular strength training will go some way to improving the structural strength of your tissues, one of the best ways to improve tissue tolerance, i.e. structural strength, is by doing local muscle endurance training. Because structural strength is determined primarily by the strength and cross-sectional area of slow twitch muscle fibers, as well as the strength of the connective tissue elements in the muscle tendon unit. And there was some research done by Jan Frieden and Richard Lieber in 1992, and again by the same pair around the year 2000. And they showed that slow twitch muscle fibers have relatively greater structural strength than fast twitch fibers have. And it takes more force to stretch and ultimately damage slow twitch muscle fibers compared to fast twitch fibers. This is primarily because slow twitch fibers are smaller and they have more so-called cellular scaffolding supporting their contractile proteins, the actin and myosin, compared to fast twitch fibers. And the contractile proteins are very susceptible to damage. In 1997, Gilbert Gleim and Malachi McHugh showed that muscle endurance training, so doing lots of repetitions against a light resistance, increases the structural strength of slow twitch fibers. Just make sure my connection's still on. Yeah, good. Yeah, endurance training improves the structural strength of the slow twitch fibers as well as the connective tissue elements, that's the fascia and so forth. So one of the things that I always recommend that people do if they're experiencing constant soreness with their stretching or even their regular weight training is to consider doing some local muscle endurance training for at least a few weeks without increasing their stretching or regular strength training loads any further, and to see if that helps. Because constantly being sore means that your muscles are damaged. Muscle soreness is a sign of muscle damage, and often that's because the structural strength of the tissues can't tolerate the mechanical stress of what you're doing. So by building that endurance, the local muscle endurance, you're building the tolerance of the tissues, and so it can offset some of the soreness. So now we'll move on to volitional strength, which are outlined on the screen. And volitional strength, like I said, is the amount of force you can produce with your muscles, and the amount you can produce depends upon the conditions you're experiencing, such as whether you're moving or not moving, how fast you're moving, and so forth. And we can assign names to squeaky chair again to each of those conditions to give us a useful way of talking about different types of strength and also different types of strength training. The maximal strength of a muscle or muscle group at any moment of time is equal to the most external resistance that you can overcome or hold with full voluntary activation of your neuromuscular system. And there are three kinds of maximal strength described in the literature. Number one, maximal concentric strength, which is a shortening action. What's the most you can lift. Maximal isometric strength, which is the most weight you can hold, and maximal eccentric strength, or eccentric as some people pronounce it, which is the most weight that you can lower. Absolute strength, which is just to the right of maximal strength on the screen, is the maximal strength that the muscles possess, plus the reserve, or the strength reserve, which is blocked off by the autonomic nervous system, which is also known as the involuntary nervous system, which you can't use voluntarily whenever you wish. if you think about those stories where you hear about mothers lifting a heavy car off a trapped infant, and you wonder how they're able to possess such incredible strength, that's because the stress of the situation release that reserve of strength and allow them to lift a heavy load. And we generally test absolute strength by using painful electrical stimulation or shock therapy, and combine that with either a maximal voluntary contraction, so you tense the muscles while you're being shocked, or we forcibly stretch the muscle while it's being shocked. The relative strength of a given muscle is calculated by dividing the approximate value of its absolute strength by its cross-sectional area or its thickness. When it comes to the nature of strength when we're moving, unsurprisingly, when we display strength when we're moving, it's called dynamic strength. When we display strength when we're not moving, it's called static strength. So you see these terms static and dynamic are ubiquitous throughout the scientific literature, not just in flexibility training, but also in strength training, and many other different disciplines. So static strength is also known as isometric strength. And a simple example of that would be having a dumbbell in your hand and flexing your, to see if you can see my hand, flexing your elbow and then just holding it there in place. And something that both flexibility and strength have in common is that they are angle specific, meaning that most gains occur at the angles trained. The same is very true for isometric or static strength exercises. And although most strength gains occur at the angles trained in isometrics, there is some transfer of strength to other joint angles. And it can be anywhere from 10% either side of the trained joint angle to 50%. And the transfer effect is greater for muscles which are performing isometric contractions in a lengthened position compared to muscles which are performing isometric contractions in a shortened position. However, even with this transfer or bleeding effect, as some people call it, it's still good practice to do isometrics in positions which are specific to your chosen sport or activity. Okay. Dynamic strength is strength when we're moving, and it's divided into several subtypes, which are primarily velocity specific or speed specific, if you want to use simpler terms. So slow strength occurs when you lift a maximal or near maximal weight and you do it very slowly. So think about doing a very slow deadlift. Okay. Amortizing strength is divided into fast and slow. So slow amortizing strength, which is also called yielding strength, is used during slow eccentric actions, such as the descending part of a squat, doing it very slowly, or slowly sliding your feet apart in a standing side split. You have to be very mindful of the amount of weight you use in these slow eccentric contractions, because the amount of force that occurs in eccentric muscle actions is much greater than either isometric or concentric muscle actions. Fast amortizing strength, which is also called shock absorbing strength, is used during fast eccentric actions, especially plyometrics. So if you think about stepping off a box and then landing and absorbing the shock, that is fast amortizing strength. Reactive strength is used when you switch quickly from eccentric to concentric muscle actions. Like in the example I've just said, if you step off a box and land and then you immediately spring back up, you're using reactive strength. And reactive strength occurs in all jumping actions except those that occur from a standing still position. Speed strength is how much strength you can display in a specific amount of time, or put simply, it's your ability to exert as much force as possible while moving at high speed, or even simpler, it's how fast. I've talked about motor abilities, and when we combine them, we call it a binary motor ability. And if you thought about speed strength being a binary motor ability, you would be correct. It's a combination of strength and speed. Therefore, it's strength, speed, strength, whichever way you want to call them. But in many research journals and strength training publications, speed strength is almost ignored as a motor ability, and it's just categorized as a subset of strength. Again, it's this strength bias that the industry has, right? So in practical terms, it is a binary motor ability, but it's typically categorized as a subset of strength. Explosive strength is your ability to rapidly produce force, and starting strength is very similar to explosive strength, but it's restrained to the very beginning of a movement, usually the first 30 milliseconds or so after the initial muscular contraction. So that's just a breakdown of the different types of strength. So you can see it like flexibility, okay? It's not just, is it correct to describe speed strength as power? Yeah, it is. And it depends on the task. Some people describe explosive strength as power. But if you're performing repeated tasks and you're measuring the wattage, say you're doing on a rowing machine, and you're doing maximum effort rows as fast as possible to get a certain wattage, and then it would be power. But yeah, pretty much. Yeah, power is the application of force at speed, but usually you're trying to get a result from that. With martial arts, which is my background, we train power by kicking and punching as hard as possible, as fast as possible. Okay. Okay, so I hope that answers your question, Jakov. Again, any of the questions, put them in the comments. That's why I'm looking over at my screen here and down at the side. So yeah, cool. Moving on. Okay, so now we're just going over some very basic strength training principles. And when we do strength training, our strength increases because of adaptations both within the nervous system or the neuromuscular system, as well as in the physical structure of the muscle itself. So the adaptations within the neuromuscular system are improved coordination and efficiency of motor units, i.e. the nervous system has become very good at firing the right motor units or the right number of motor units in the right sequence, while not firing the motor units that don't need to be fired. Okay. Adaptations within the physical structure of the muscle comes down to hypertrophy, which is an increase in muscle mass or the amount of muscle stuff present in the muscle. So our strength increases because our body has adapted to the specific resistance exercises that we're doing. Contrary to the very popular belief that we should change exercises every workout or every other workout to avoid the so-called muscle confusion, we've known since at least the work of a very famous Polish researcher called Zbigniew Naglak, and I hope I've pronounced his name correctly, but it was in around 1979, and he was one of the first to tell us that adaptation to strength training is quicker if the exercises remain the same for a period of time. So by chasing this so-called, or trying to avoid muscular confusion and changing exercises every workout, you're actually diminishing your ability to adapt. And so it's for this reason that when you start a training program, or you start a new part of a current training program, you should repeat the same exercises and training load for a couple of workouts, ideally around 2 or 3 training sessions, and then keep doing the same exercises but change the weight and the number of repetitions. But there does come a point, however, when your body becomes habituated to the training stimulus, and it struggles to get stronger, and that's due to a biological law called the law of accommodation. And it's a very fascinating subject, and it applies across all biology, not just the humans. And it states that as biological organisms are exposed to the same stimulus repeatedly over time, that biological organism will produce less and less and less of a response until there's almost no noticeable response. And you've experienced this yourself. Think about when you've walked into a room and you smell a new scent, whether it's freshly baked bread or an incense candle. You'll notice the new smell, almost immediately. But after a minute to 2 minutes, you almost become nose blind. and you can't really differentiate that scent from the smell of the ambient smells, okay? At least not without really trying to notice it and focus it. So it's a very similar process that happens with strength training and even flexibility training, right? Typically, it's referred to as plateauing or a plateau. And there comes a point where you become habituated to an exercise, and the only real way to create a greater stimulus is to either keep increasing the training volume, i.e. the amount of weight you're lifting and the number of times you're doing it, but sometimes that isn't possible or desirable. So if you've been using the same exercises for a while, you should look at changing them, or at least altering the way you perform them, and doing variations of that exercise. For example, if you've been doing regular back squats with a barbell, you should try, Cossack squats, front lunges, goblet squats, and so forth. And we know from the work of a very famous Soviet researcher called Gregory Kukushkin. It was in the early 80s, around 1982, 1983, and later Vladimir Zatsiorsky, who wrote a very good book called The Science and Practice of Strength Training, which you should get and read if you have even a passing interest in strength and conditioning. But what these guys found was that, ideally changes to the specific exercises that you're doing shouldn't happen more often than every 2 weeks. But ideally, it should happen at least once every 6 weeks. So say you've started a training program. Between 2 and 6 weeks after you start your new training program, you should look at changing the exercises to provide a different stimulus, at least for 1 or 2 workouts, and then you can go back to your previous exercises. And a good time to do this is during the deload week, which is usually occurs around 4 to 6 weeks after a particular point in training. And it's where you scale back the amount of training that you're doing by as much as 50% in some cases. You could do alternative exercises, or you can even take the week off if you wanted to. But changing the exercises up during a deload week and using lighter loads, because you'd be doing relatively new exercises, you won't be doing the same ones. It can be both physically and mentally refreshing. Okay, and you do that for about a week, and then you can go back to your previous training loads. Or if you like the new variations you're doing, you can pursue that as well. Okay, there's many ways to skin a cat, as they say, but I like cats, so I'm not skinning any. We can also classify exercises based on the type of resistance and the character of the movement. Yeah, if there's any questions, I'll answer them at the end. But yes, I'll write down the titles of the books. Most commonly, people will do something, will do dynamic exercises against a constant resistance. So it means the involved body part is, yeah, that's it, Roberto. Thank you for posting that. It's a great book, Science and Practice of Strength Training. So most people do dynamic exercises with a constant resistance. So think about doing bicep curls with a barbell. It's dynamic and the weight doesn't change, so it remains the same. Therefore, it is a constant load. We can also do dynamic exercises against something called accommodating resistance. And this means that the resistance changes while the speed of the movement stays the same. And using bands and chains in addition to a kettlebell or a barbell is an example of accommodating resistance. And the main reason why people use accommodating resistance is it helps you to learn how to accelerate through a particular phase of a movement. If you're not that interested in acceleration, if you're not an athlete, then it's not really something you need to mess with, unless you just want to give it a try. It's up to you. Next, we can do dynamic exercises against an elastic resistance. And this is when we use things like resistance bands without using another weight. So we're only using the resistance band. And so the sole resistance is coming from that band. And with the bands, the resistance they provide usually at the beginning of a movement is very small, but it increases at the end of the movement. So the force profiles are different. But if you want a more consistent or constant level of resistance throughout the entire movement, then you have to use harder or thicker or longer resistance bands. If you want to concentrate the resistance or the effort at the end of the movement, then use a shorter and softer resistance band. And some people say that resistance bands aren't very good because they're not very accurate in terms of the amount of resistance that they provide. Say you have a black band and it says a 5 kilogram resistance, but most companies which produce resistance bands, especially the top ones, they measure the resistance in a dynamometer. So oftentimes the resistance that's stated on a resistance band is actually accurate. We also do static exercises or static strength exercises, aka isometrics, and again that'll tend to be against a constant resistance. That resistance can come from an immovable object like a wall or the floor, or even someone else's, or even your own limbs. Say you're stretching and you're forcing the other hand against you. The great thing about isometrics is they're very effective and very versatile, and they're a very underrated method of building strength as well as flexibility. There's another famous Soviet/Russian researcher and physiologist called Leo Matveev, and he influenced many of the kind of greats of flexibility training, Thomas Kurz, Pavel Tsatsouline, etc. And he was among the first to give us real practical information when it comes to using isometrics. And he recommended that in a typical workout, especially if you're just starting, you should do up to but no more than 6 different isometric exercises. Do 2 to 3 sets per exercise, and in each set, do 2 to 3 tensions or contractions of up to 10 seconds, separated by a few seconds each, and rest 1 to 3 minutes each. I'm just going to take a drink because my voice is going. Okay, and you can repeat that kind of workout up to 4 times a week, but it's always guided by soreness and recovery. Okay, now bear in mind that recommendation from Matveev is really for people who are starting out with isometrics. As you get more experience, the time, intensity, number of contractions, and number of sets can increase. And although Matveev recommended up to 6 different exercises, ideally you will limit that to 1 exercise per muscle group, because isometric training, especially at long muscle lengths, as occurs during isometric stretching, is very, very taxing. And doing several different types of isometric exercises for 1 muscle group is going to annihilate those muscles, and you're going to be sore for days and days and days and days. And while occasional soreness is to be expected and is okay, you shouldn't be very sore after every workout. Now, Matveev also said that people tend to recover quicker and be better prepared for the next set of isometrics, i.e. they've done 1 set, they're rested, ready for the second set, if they do something relatively easy but active during the rest period, so it's active recovery, right? So rather than just say you've done your middle split isometric stretches, rather than just lie there on the floor crying in a sweaty heap, praying to whatever gods that you worship, Matveev recommended doing focused breathing exercises. For example, breathe in through the nose for 4 seconds, hold for 2 seconds, breathe out through the mouth for 6 seconds, hold for 2 seconds, rinse and repeat. You can also gently shake your muscles. Think of it like a very light self-massage. Or if you really want to supercharge your flexibility progress, you could even do easy, relaxed, static passive stretches for the muscles you just worked while you rest in preparation for the next set. So let's say you've done isometrics for side or middle splits. After you finish the isometric set, you can sit on the floor and open your legs into a straddle stretch, also called a seated side split, and just to the point where you feel a mild stretch. You're not trying to really stretch those muscles, okay, because they've just been subjected to quite an intense load. And so if you are stretching in between sets, it's very relaxed, very gentle stretching, literally at the point where you feel the initiation of resistance. That's it. Isometrics are phenomenal for developing strength, but like I said earlier, they develop most of their strength at the angle which is trained, or the angle at which the muscles are tensed, okay? And also, if they are your only method of strength training, you'll find that after about 6 to 8 weeks, they're going to stop being effective and you're going to start to plateau, or your strength may even start to decline. So 2 things that you can do to prevent your strength and also your flexibility from stagnating are: number 1, change the position in which you're tensing the muscles, i.e. increase the stretch, which you're going to be doing anyway if you're doing isometrics to increase flexibility. But the bare minimum is you should increase the stretch at least once every 4 to 6 weeks. Now, if you're not increasing the stretch more frequently than that and you're trying to become flexible, it's going to take you a very, very long time to get flexible, even using isometrics. But number 2, you can increase the amount of tension in the muscles by adding external load. And this is very useful once you've kind of hit the furthest you can go in a stretch, but you want to keep getting stronger. So for example, let's say you've got your 180-degree side split, and you kind of hit in a couple of minutes on the tensions now, and you just want to get stronger without tensing for longer. You can just hold a kettlebell in that position, and what you can do is, as you hold the kettlebell, is contract the adductors to lift your hips off the floor by about half an inch to an inch, and just hold that. Or if you're feeling confident, you could do a suspended side split, not necessarily between 2 chairs like Jean-Claude Van Damme, but maybe while you're resting on some books, for example. That could be very useful. Now, this sounds simple, right? And it is, but there are still many people who lift small weights and they think that they're going to get strong, right? And in untrained people, so someone who's never trained before or hasn't trained for a good few months, 3 to 6 months, the minimum resistance they need to overcome in order to get some kind of training effect and to adapt and get stronger is about 20% of their personal best. For people who have been training for a long time, at least a year or longer, they need to use as much as 80% of their personal best. And oftentimes you'll see the amount of resistance described with words like maximal, submaximal, light, etc. But it can be difficult to know exactly what that means, because what's maximal for you is different. Is not the same as what is maximal for me. We have different maximums. But the figures on screen provide you with a very rough guide to what constitutes a certain level of resistance based upon the number of repetitions you can perform. With maximal resistance, you can do only 1 repetition of that movement. Okay, it's the most weight you can move once. Also, it's called your 1 repetition maximum. With submaximal, you can do 2 or 3 repetitions. With heavy resistance, you can do 4 to 7 repetitions, moderately heavy 8 to 12, so on and so forth. Heavy is highlighted in red because that tends to be the rep range which is most effective for loaded stretching. So whether you're doing wide squats or horse stance squats, whether you're doing Jefferson curls, Romanian deadlifts, a weight that you can move with good technique for 4 to 7 repetitions tends to be most effective for improving flexibility and strength at the same time. If you're doing 8 to 12 repetitions, it tends to improve muscle mass, not so much strength, and flexibility. The flexibility needle doesn't really move. Submaximal, maximal, and maximal resistances tend to be too high, and so the nervous system tends to provide more tension to the area, and you find it difficult to move that limit of range of motion. So 4 to 7 repetitions seems to be the Goldilocks zone. You could do 3 sets of 6. I mean, some people can do a couple of sets of 8 and still get that effect. I tend to say it's 4 to 8, but according to the literature, it's around 4 to 7. And we noticed that 4 to 7, a heavy load, is most effective for improving strength and flexibility. Bear in mind, a lot of people will say 8 to 12 is the hypertrophy zone, but research has shown that you can get the same amount of muscle building or hypertrophy using 8 to 12 repetitions or doing 25 plus repetitions. The main thing is that you take the tissues to the point of fatigue, okay, or to the point of failure. So if you're just trying to build muscle, then you could use any weight you want, and as long as you do enough repetitions to take those tissues to the point of failure, you're going to see hypertrophy and muscle building. So that's just something to bear in mind. I've missed a slide out. Bear with me a second. No, I haven't. Never mind. The things that go wrong when you're live, eh? Okay. So I apologize. I thought I'd missed a slide out, but I haven't done. Right. Yeah, so it's all good. It's all good. I thought I'd missed an important slide out, but I haven't. So now we're going to talk about flexibility strength. It's not a good day for technology. So as I have explained, when two motor abilities come together, we call it a binary motor ability. And unsurprisingly, when flexibility and strength come together, we call that flexibility strength. It's just an easy way of saying flexibility and strength, okay? That's all it means. And again, like I said in yesterday's session, some of you like to use the word mobility to describe flexibility and strength. If you want to do that, that's fine. You can do that. But again, that's not how it's described from a scientific perspective. And flexibility and strength are of vital importance to each other. Flexibility is important to strength because you cannot display strength or develop flexibility, you cannot display strength or develop strength without flexibility. Since flexibility is your range of motion, and you can only move a joint or a limb within the limits of your range of motion, any strength exercise you do will always occur within the limits of your flexibility. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to first develop flexibility before you can develop strength. Now, in some instances, you do, but it's not always the case. Strength training can be very effective for improving range of motion. And for some people, to them, it will be the most effective way. But like I said in yesterday's session, most people get the greatest benefit from some combination of the different types of stretching. And something to understand is that a stretch is any exercise which takes the joint to its limit of range of motion and the tissues to their limits of extensibility with the intention of maintaining or increasing that range of motion. That's a stretch in a nutshell. So if you lift weights with the intention of improving your range of motion, you are still stretching. You're just doing it with added load. Hence, some people call it loaded stretching. So these people who say stretching doesn't work, you should strength train instead, they don't realize the irony in what they're saying, because they're basically saying, don't stretch because it doesn't work, but you should still stretch. Right? It's silly. And, you know, as I said in yesterday's session, while strength training will be most effective for some people, generally, it's not more effective than regular strength training. It can be as effective as. And like I said, for some people, it's more effective, but that's not necessarily because it's what their body best responds to. It's probably more likely that it's effective for them because they just prefer strength training. So doing a strength-based exercise meets their psychological and emotional needs. And so they're going to maintain a regular loaded stretching habit, and they're going to build strength and flexibility over time. But they probably, you know, as I've seen in many cases, probably did static passive stretching a couple of times, didn't get much from it, and said, well, it doesn't work for me. But how does strength training increase flexibility? Well, there's a number of mechanisms that have been proposed. And again, many of these are theoretical still. They're just really, they're quite accurate guesses based upon the evidence we have. But most things that we know about the human body are still a guess. Now, the main mechanism that has been put forward is that the combination of stretch with strong contractions facilitates sarcomerogenesis, which is just a really fancy term that means more sarcomeres or the contractile components of a muscle are added end to end, and thus it makes the muscle longer. There was a great review in 2012 by Kieran Sullivan and his colleagues, and if they've mentioned any papers and you want the references, let me know and I'll put them in the comments. Just taking a drink. And so this article by Kieran Sullivan and colleagues in 2012, they looked into this and they said that the effect probably occurs in all types of strength-based stretching, but eccentric stretching is the most effective way of achieving longitudinal growth of muscle fibers. So I showed some studies yesterday which demonstrated that even static stretching, if it's held with enough intensity and it's done for a long enough period of time, will increase tissue length. Eccentric training is just a much greater stimulus, so the intensity is dialed right up. So naturally, we'll see this lengthening phenomenon occurring in a much shorter time frame. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that just because eccentric training it probably produces greater increases in muscle length, that it's more effective for increasing range of motion. Okay, and in fact, it's been shown that it's not more effective than static stretching for improving range of motion. There was a study in 2004 by Russell Nelson and William Bandy. William Bandy is a very, very famous researcher, and they found that after 6 weeks of training, eccentric stretching and static stretching were equal in terms of improving range of motion. So there was no difference between the two. It's just the mechanisms behind them were slightly different. It's likely the eccentric training produced a change in muscle length, whereas the static stretching probably altered stretch tolerance, because remember, it's below that 6-week threshold. So again, it comes down to how your body responds to a particular type of stretching, how well designed the stretching training program is, how intensely you push yourself, although I'm not necessarily saying more is better. Other proposed mechanisms as to why strength training can improve flexibility are changes in stretch tolerance and alterations in stretch reflex sensitivity. The benefits of strength training are many, okay? And if there's one thing that strength training has over static passive stretching, if you were going to do one or the other, right? Again, you can do both and you won't necessarily be doing more time, spending more time doing it. If you just said, okay, I'm just going to do one or the other, and you were going to choose one, I would suggest strength training for a couple of reasons. Number one, I don't actually like static passive stretching, contrary to everybody's popular belief. I get called a stretching zealot, static stretching fanboy, and all these different names. I find it so boring. I don't like doing it, but my body responds well to it, so I need to do it, right? But the benefits with, if you're going to do one or the other, I would say strength training, because there are benefits which come with it, which are important to longevity and older age that you possibly don't get with static passive stretching. And they are improved tissue tolerance, which I talked about earlier, although heavy strength training doesn't improve tissue tolerance as well as directed local muscle endurance training. You have greater force production at long muscle lengths, which is important for athletic performance, right? Athletic performance is about our ability to get into these positions and exert volitional force in those positions, so you can push off or hit a ball or swipe a racket or punch someone, whatever you want to do. It improves coordination as well. So your ability to move your body and control your body improves with strength training too. Strength training is also really effective when it comes to cold flexibility, and that means giving you access to your maximum range of motion without needing to warm up and stretch first. And we call this your cold flexibility, i.e. it's the flexibility you have when you roll out of bed first thing in the morning. And back when I was coaching the England full contact karate team, a goal that each fighter on the team had to achieve was being able to display their maximum kicking height without a warm-up as soon as they woke up in the morning. And with the right training methods, it's perfectly achievable. If you want a great book for that, check out Stretching Scientifically by Thomas Kurz. Thomas was one of my mentors. And again, I keep looking over here because this is where Facebook is, but I know you guys are looking at me this way. And your cold flexibility is really a reflection of how physically ready you are at a moment's notice. For example, in the martial arts, that's my background, good cold flexibility is, being able to kick someone in the head without first needing to warm up and stretch. And it doesn't mean you abuse the ability and never warm up and stretch again, but it definitely comes in handy when you stood outside Burger King at 3 o'clock in the morning and some little punk is trying to steal your phone. But that's a story for a different time. And there are 3 primary methods that we use to improve strength and flexibility. We do concentric stretching, isometric stretching, and eccentric stretching. And with concentric stretching, you start in the stretched position and then you shorten the muscle under tension. An example would be if you had a cable machine, you're holding the handle and you start in an externally rotated position. So the internal rotators are on stretch and then you bring it in, okay, and take it back out. That's concentric stretching. The concentric phase is slow and controlled. You hold it tight and then you just take it back out again. And you get a little bit more of a stretch on each repetition. With isometric stretching, you stretch the muscles, contract the muscles being stretched, relax, increase the stretch, contract, relax, increase, etc., etc. And with eccentric stretching, you start in the shortened position and you lengthen the muscles while they are under tension. An example would be in a standing position with your legs staggered, and then without using your hands to support you, slide out into a front split. Okay, and you go all the way down to the floor or as far as you can. So with each of these, with concentric and eccentric especially, more time is spent on the named phase. So in concentric stretching, you take longer with the concentric phase, and the eccentric phase on that is very, very short. The eccentric stretching, the eccentric phase is long, and then you come back to the beginning relatively quickly. You could, in theory, combine all of these into one method. So you could start at the beginning, say you're doing a split. You could spread your legs eccentrically into a front split, hold that position isometrically, and then bring your legs back together. But it is incredibly intense, and you would probably manage 2 to 3 sets before you felt like your muscles were going to tear off your bones. I suggest keeping them separate and doing them individually. If you're going to put them into a workout, do eccentric first because it's the most intense, and so you need to make sure your muscles and body are fresh to do them. Then follow with concentric, then follow it with isometric. Yeah, so that's that. Hopefully you enjoyed it. So people have sent me messages asking me about the Master Flexibility Trainer course, because this really is these lessons you've been having are a snapshot of the course, and people wanted to know what it involves and what the benefits are. I'm just going to run through some of them now. So the main benefit of doing the Master Flexibility Trainer course is you learn all of the why behind flexibility training, but at a much deeper level. If you thought yesterday and today's session went into detail, if you join the Master Flexibility Trainer course, you will be amazed at the amount of detail that's in there. And it's all explained in a way that is easy to comprehend and easy to understand. And you have access to me twice a week. We do these live calls like this, but you speak to me face to face, and you can ask any questions you want. There's a forum you can access. You can send messages, instant chat, instant messenger. There's a chat room, all these cool little functions. So if there's any part of the why you're not sure about, you can ask me, okay? Number 2 is you stay ahead of the latest scientific breakthroughs, which means you are ahead of the learning curve. So you always remain an expert. It's not a case of you have to take the course, become an expert, science races ahead, you then have to take the course again. No, not at all. The course evolves and updates with the science. So you're always ahead of the curve, and that gives you an advantage over everybody else in the industry. Number 3 is you will learn to make you or anyone else flexible in the safest and shortest possible time. Okay, so it's called the Master Flexibility Trainer course, but you can take it if you want to get flexible yourself. If you want to really get to grips with flexibility, whether you are a coach now, you want to become a coach, or you're thinking about it in the distant future, you learn these techniques and you can apply them to anyone, because the principles of flexibility training remain the same regardless of the person or the sport. Okay. Number 4 is you actually learn how to coach human beings. So it's not a case of people come in and they fit to your template. It's you change the training program to fit the human being based upon their physical, psychological, and emotional experiences. Okay, so it's a very holistic program. Number 5, you can earn a great income. The pandemic has made people far more aware of their physical health, and flexibility is the primary motor ability. It's the one everybody needs. It's the one everybody loses as they get older unless they do something about it. And online coaching has become huge business, but you need something to separate yourself from the rest. And this course is doing that for people right now. I get messages every week, people saying their income has improved because they're taking this course and they can apply the stuff from it straight away. And finally, you connect with an amazing global community. 60% of the people taking the course on the forum, okay, it's not held on Facebook or anything like that. It's on a live forum where you can post and ask questions 24 hours a day. 60% of people on the course are not from the UK where I'm based. They're from Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Philippines, North and South America, all over Europe, Africa. Okay, so it's an amazing global community that's growing. And if you want in on it, the course is registration for the course starting on the 20th of June is still open. The early bird offer ends on Monday. So if you want to get in, you've still a few days remaining to do that. So now we're going to go over questions that you guys have asked, and I'm just going to bring my phone over here. It's still kind of weird because I'm technically in the future because of the delay. So let's just go over some of these questions. And if you have any that come to your mind, post them and I'll happily answer them. So Ashley said, might be a question for the end and may be a little off-piste. I'm currently doing a lot of isometric strength contraction exercises following surgery. How effective can these be for recovery? Very effective. Isometrics are a core component of many rehabilitation programs, and they're incredibly safe. I just monitor the range of motion that you're using, but isometric strength training is incredibly safe, incredibly effective, and it's a shame more people don't do it. But so 6 years ago, I had both my hips replaced because I was injured serving my country in the army, and I was told I would never do the splits again. Using isometrics, I was able to get my splits back in 6 months. So it's absolutely phenomenal. Okay, and good luck with your surgery as well, your surgery recovery. I hope it goes well. Okay, well, it doesn't seem to be any more questions. I think I've answered them all. So yeah, look, guys, I apologize for the signal cutting off and having to do this part 2 of the webinar. Facebook, it's just the way Facebook is. Ooh, here we go. Lam says, how can I measure an effective time range for isometric stretching, also reps? Yeah, so I went through that in this webinar, so I don't know if you saw that bit, but generally speaking, you're looking at 3 to 5 sets of 3 to 5 contractions. Hold the contractions for around 10 to 15 seconds, but a golden rule of thumb, and I got this from Thomas Kurz, is the final contraction should always be held for at least 30 seconds. So say you do a set of 5 contractions of isometric stretches, right? So you get into position, you stretch, you contract, stretch, contract, etc. You're doing 5 contractions. The first 4 should be for about 10 to 15 seconds, and the purpose of those contractions is to lower the sensitivity to the stretch, whether that's because of changed stretch tolerance or a change in the stretch reflex. It doesn't matter. Then the final one, the 30-second contraction, is to build strength in that position. Now, the shorter contractions will build strength as well, but the last one, the final contraction, is at least 30 seconds. I get people doing it up to 2 to 5 minutes. and it does make some people pray, and scream, and cry. But the effect is phenomenal. It supercharges your flexibility training. So the last contraction should be at least 30 seconds. Ashley says, thanks for the answer, Dan. Gives me a lot of hope. Yeah, no problem. Keep me updated on how you do. I'd be interested to hear that. If there are no more questions, guys, I'm going to go. Again, apologies for Facebook doing what it did. It's so annoying. I don't like Facebook, but I've set up this group to make things easier for all of you. So any questions, put them in the comments, and hopefully I'll see you tomorrow for the coaching webinar. Thanks very much, folks. Bye-bye.